Welcome. This video interview is one of a series of 7. My name is Chris Heald. Throughout these videos, I will be interviewing John Beckford. During the COVID-19 pandemic in late 2020, John and I wondered why cybernetics and its learning about systems has not played a greater role in the global response to the pandemic. We concluded that cybernetics was not as accessible as it should be. So we decided to conduct these interviews. John is currently president of the Cybernetics Society and has written extensively on the subject. We are both consultant practitioners who use the ideas in our work. We have known one another and collaborated for approximately 20 years. We have never made videos before. Each one lasts about an hour. The series is in a logical order, but they are also designed to be standalone, so you don't need to watch them in sequence if you choose not to. We have had great fun making these videos, and as Stafford Beer might suggest, we hope you will find them more or less useful. Please feel free to contact either of us.
Yeah, no, well, good morning all, or well, welcome. Thanks, John. And just to explain, how I come to this. So I've known John for about 20 years, and I've probably been a kind of user and a practitioner of some cybernetic ideas, not necessarily having understood them. So I'm a fan and a friend, but I'm here to question and understand and probe it a bit more, so that I can see how and we help everyone see how it might be more relevant to the wider world. So, John, I think it might be quite helpful if you started us off by explaining, a bit about what cybernetics is, but maybe how you came to meet it for the first time.
Okay, so the first encounter with cybernetics was about 33 years ago, when I was working in banking as an internal consultant, looking at the processes of organizational change in a high street bank, and was being taught a whole series of tools and techniques rooted in the sort of traditional work improvement, efficiency improvement world that frankly did not work when applied in practice. And they didn't work because, one, it took too long for the organizational process to actually respond to the changes that were being proposed, and two, the situations in which they were being applied were changing faster than the organization itself could respond to the need. So what you ended up with what I called a perpetually failing problem-solving engine, that every time you tried to solve a problem, your solution came in and the problem had changed again. So I started looking for ways of thinking about and managing organizations in real time, so that the problem and the solution would be closer to being synchronized than they were in the traditional method. And through that, I met a chap I used to commute with called Bob Flood, and Bob was a lecturer in systems science, and we started a series of conversations about systems thinking and cybernetics, and started then exploring how we might apply some of the ideas of cybernetics within the bank.
Okay, so there was a frustration that something wasn't working as well as it needed to, and you got in conversation with Bob, and you put cybernetics and systems science in the same phrase there. Are they the same thing?
Oh, how many years have you got to debate this?
Just a few minutes.
A few minutes. So the idea of thinking in systems arguably goes back to Bogdanov about 100 years ago, early 1900s, Russian revolutionary, describing the world as nests of interconnected elements, and so observable as behaving as if they were a system. That's the kind of idea of systems thinking. Cybernetics goes back rather further, back to Plato about 2,500 years ago, who used the word cybernetics, cybernetes, to a political analogy to describe the behavior of a statesman steering the ship of state across a harbour. So the whole notion of cybernetics is rooted in this idea of purposefulness, as in we act with intent towards a destination. We're dealing with a complex situation. We're dealing with an adaptive situation. So if you like, cybernetics itself is the application of governance to a system. Does that work?
So I'm sure we'll come back to purposefulness, complex, adaptive.
We will.
They sound like three pretty critical concepts, but just probe that a bit more though. So cybernetics has always been around as a way of thinking about a whole system.
Yes, and if you
2,500 years.
If you study the Tao, so the Chinese, the way, the descriptive language is very cybernetic in its nature. If you look at Buddhism, there's a lot of cybernetics in the notion of Buddhism. So the ideas have been around for a very, very long time. The evolution of cybernetics as an emerging science really is the last 80 years. Started to emerge in the 1940s through the work of people like Norbert Wiener, who wrote a book called Cybernetics in 1948, and Claude Shannon, I think his name's Claude, who was a progenitor of information theory. And if we look at today, the world in which we operate today is often described as the world of information, and we talk about this as being the information age. And what gives the cybernetics potential in this information age is it is rooted in the idea of using information as the driver of organizational control and change. And whether that organization is a human system, a human being, whether it's an organization like a bank or a building society or a railway, or indeed an organism in nature, a tree or a piece of grass or an ecosystem, we can observe them to behave in ways which lend themselves to cybernetic description, which is a different way of saying we can observe them to display cybernetic behaviors. Are they cybernetic systems? Is a sort of probably a slightly different argument.
Okay, so if I'm a systems scientist, do I have general acceptance that cybernetics is important?
I would hope so.
It's a fairly widely accepted concept that people would reference when they're looking at how systems work.
Yes, a lot of people would. Some people would, and this is another of the stupidities of the way that we think these days. Being systemic means embracing systems as wholes and recognizing that within those systems there are elements which are in dynamic interaction. Where we meet challenges particularly is in the notion of purposefulness, and whether purposefulness belongs to the system, to the individual that observes the system, and indeed some might argue about whether systems are themselves purposeful. So, and that was why it was particularly important for me to pick up the word purposeful at the beginning of this conversation, because when we look at an organization which is behaving cybernetically, it is working towards an outcome. So it is trying to fulfill a purpose, even if that purpose is only its own survival. So we can describe genes as behaving cybernetically in the sense that they pursue their own survival. They're not sentient things, but they're adapted to seek survival. So we can look at the work of somebody like Richard Dawkins as a sort of massively complicated way of explaining all of that in evolutionary terms. So there's a sort of an observation of systems which lend themselves to description using cybernetic language. There are some people who would argue that systems just are. So the purposefulness thing doesn't come to them. If you then explore the range of systemic ideas and particularly systemic methodologies, so ways of thinking about systems, you range from very early work in things like operational research, which again go back 80, 90 years, where they applied to relatively simple systems where everybody has agreement generally about purpose, to more complex systems, so you can have systems which are observed to behave in a particular way. Everybody agrees about the aim, and they're relatively small. And at the other extreme, you have complex systems which are coercive in nature, in which power becomes the device which is used to regulate. And sitting in the middle of all that is systems of which there are a plurality of interpretations. So there are many interpretations of their purpose. So the systems methodology sort of developed, and there are about 20 of them, a range across that whole landscape. So we can be systemic and talk about systems engineering. So systems engineering deals with, let's call them finite problems of how do you put a man on the moon? Once you've decided that you want to put a man on the moon, designing the bit of kit that gets him or her there requires something called systems engineering, which says, do all the parts of this system work together in a coherent way, which enable the fulfillment of the purpose? What systems engineering can't help you do is have a conversation about purpose itself. So it takes purpose as a given. At the other extreme, you have a dictatorial environment in which, in a complex system, complex coercive context, in which one person sits at the center, or one body sits at the center like a Politburo, and determines what is good for everybody within that system. And so there's an argument that that loops you back to a simple unitary system through the exercise of power. In the middle of that is where most of us probably are, which is there are different ways of describing, there are different ways of interpreting, there are different ways of understanding systems. And one of the things we have to do as human beings is find a way of having the conversation about purpose. Before we can decide what to do, we have to decide why we're doing it. So we get purpose first, followed by method, if you like.
Yeah, okay. So these systems can be small or large,
yeah,
tiny or huge. They can be natural. They can be, about us as individuals. They can be about big organizations. They can be about economies, countries. So there's what I'm hearing, and maybe this links to the question about, why we're doing this now and why this is relevant, is that actually there's a purposefulness about a cybernetic system, that means that you're seeking certain outcomes if you are trying to influence or change or develop that system. Is that right?
Yes, so as a cybernetic practitioner, there's an argument that I am observing a system, and I observe that system to have a purpose. So there's a sort of observer-defined purposefulness to a system. And one of the practical things you have to do is validate whether or not the purpose I observe and the purpose that the people within the system are pursuing are the same thing. So there's purposefulness in the system being observed. There's also purposefulness in the observer. Why am I observing that system, and what is it that I am seeking to influence through that observation? So am I merely describing it, saying, look, I have seen this thing and it looks like this to me, as a basis of a conversation? Am I making some prognosis about its future, saying I've observed this system, I have seen these things, and I believe if it carries on doing that, then the end point will be this? Or am I trying to cure it or improve it or ameliorate it in some way, in which case I'm saying I've observed the system, I see these things in its future, in order to avoid that or maximize that, depending what I want to do, it should do these things. So we should change it, or it should be changed in this way. So we've got the sort of a language which lets us diagnose something as an observer, which lets us make assertions about its possible futures, and which lets us come up with approaches to helping it achieve what we think its purpose is, which is complicated. So that there's a necessity of engagement there then in saying, particularly in a human system, if we're observing a railway, we can observe the railway to be doing certain things, and so we might say, well, the railway makes me late for work because the reliability is so poor. I can complete my journey, but I complete my journey late. So it does two things. It gets us to our destination, but it gets us there late. So if we really want to observe the improvement in the system, then what do we do with the railway in order to make journey times more reliable? And so now, if we then go and talk to the people that own the railway and say to them, this is what we've observed, we can only start to make progress in, quote, improvement, unquote, if we have agreed with them that their purpose and our observed purpose are the same thing.
Yeah, okay. And is cybernetics, most applied and most useful when you're doing that kind of descriptive diagnostic piece, or is it more useful when you're looking at the active process of trying to improve the system? Where does it really have greatest relevance there?
It's a really good question. Neither and both is probably the right answer to that question. So if managers in organizational managers of organizations understand the cybernetics and apply them deliberately, then and consciously with understanding, then the organization behaves much more effectively in the first place. So when we observe it, we can observe it to be behaving as a cybernetic system and kind of doing the things it wants to do very, very well. So it really is in that situation, the organization has gone into that sort of, let's call it semi-aware cybernetic state, because it can only ever be semi-aware really, and it is applying the principles of cybernetics to itself. Where people like me typically come along is where an organization is struggling with one or more aspects of its performance, and in doing so says, it starts to ask itself questions about what's going wrong. So then an observer can come in a sort of diagnostic mode and kind of go, I've had to look at it, I see these elements, I see these interactions, I see these limitations on performance or these weaknesses, which might be ameliorated by doing these things. And that's essentially by doing cybernetics better within the organization. And the cybernetics is really then about how the organization generates, captures, and uses data about its performance, converts it into information, and uses that then to close the gap between its current performance and the performance it would like to have. So between the destination it's currently got and the destination it might like. And that translates as cost reduction. So we can look at an organization and say, you expected to make £1 this year, you're only going to make 50 pence. And actually you're only making 50 pence because either you're not selling enough or you're spending too much. So what can you do about your processes in order to increase revenue or reduce cost?
Yeah, okay. So you're working with the difference between what I'm going to call the declared or articulated purpose for the organization and the observable. When you look at the system, what you observe as the kind of driving purpose that is causing the system to operate in a particular way. And you're then looking at the gap between those things when you're looking at how you close that gap. Yes?
Yeah, so it's all about closing the gap between what you're going to get and what you wanted to get and what you can do about the inputs to the system to change that outcome.
And which way do you tend to go? What's most common? So do you go, okay, the purpose as articulated needs further attention and work because it's inaccurate, or do you go into the detail of how to change or alter the minutiae of the system?
Well, sometimes it's not the minutiae of the system. Sometimes it can be very, very profound. To some extent, the answer depends on the client, and in the sense that there's a dialogue with the client that says, you'll say to them, why are you here? What does the organization exist to do. And this is, we're talking about human systems now, human organizations, as opposed to natural organisms. You can't have the conversation with an amoeba. When you go and talk to a board, you're saying, what does this organization seek to do in the world? What is its purpose? What's the reason for which it exists? And they'll usually have some sort of answer, and they vary from profit making as a sort of fairly narrow objective to some sort of transformation they want to bring about in the world. So then what you can do is you can look at the way the organization deals with its processes, the behaviors of its people, the information that it uses, and you can reflect back to the organization. Well, yeah, if you're trying to achieve A, then these things are helping you and these things are kind of getting in the way. So you might want to do some things around the second group that stop them getting in the way. They might say, yeah, we're all about profit. And then when you go and look at the way they behave, you find that actually they're all about not profit. The behaviors in the organization, the processes, whether intentionally or not, have the effect of inhibiting profit. So you might say, oh, because you behave in this way, your costs are too high. Because you have a failure. So a good example, years and years ago, was on a railway where the conversation was about railway performance. The objective of the railway was to make a profit. When you looked at the way they were organized, the only way that the organization could make a profit was to ensure that its key supplier failed. Because when you looked at the way its processes were put together, their profit depended on other people's ineptitude. And pointing that out changes the conversation that the organization then has with itself and with its suppliers, because it can kind of go, hadn't realized that, so we need to do something. We need to do something about it. So that's it's never linear, it's never simple, it's never straightforward. There are sort of complex conversations and complex understandings that if you continue running the business the way you run it, then you will never ever break through that barrier and make a profit or move into survivability, because these things get in the way of you actually achieving the things that you said you were going to do. And it might be, and we've all seen it, it might be people with the wrong skills in an organization. So they're sitting in the middle, they're doing their jobs very faithfully, but the job itself is wrong. So improvement then, making them more efficient at doing the wrong thing doesn't help. So we need to recognize where the work that's going on doesn't contribute to the outcome and find a way of changing it.
Yeah, so if you're working as a practitioner then in a system, so what I'm hearing you say there is that almost the higher up and the more of the system you can influence, the more rewarding or beneficial your intervention might be. So that's what I'm hearing you say, that the more of the system you can start to look at from a purpose point of view, the greater the impact is likely to be.
Absolutely. So the individual working on the what do they call it these days, the coal face of the organisation, the front line, the shop floor, whatever the language is constrained as a member of that organisation to work within a particular set of rules and processes and guidelines. So the individual's freedom to change what they do, how they do it, and why they do it is very, very limited. When you look then into the boardroom or into the council chamber or that sort of senior management group who run or even the stakeholders that own the organisation, they have complete freedom within the law to kind of change the purpose of the organisation, change its direction, change the way it works. So they're much less constrained than the individual. If I, as an individual at the shop floor level in an organisation, decide that I'm working in a burger joint and I decide that selling burgers is really bad for people, it's not going to go down well for me to stop selling burgers at the counter. I don't have that freedom. The people that run the organisation can say, well, maybe we should move from meat-based product to plant-based product, So we can continue to sell burgers, but we'll use a fundamentally different methodology because there's a challenge in the world that we want to address by doing that. So there's a set of recursive embedments of the organization that constrain the behavior of the individual, of the subunit, of the group, of the branch, whatever. And so the higher up that chain of hierarchical, and it's information informed hierarchy. Information is a mechanism that creates structure in organizations, and the freedoms and powers of people in the higher parts of the hierarchy are greater than those at the bottom, so they have more power. So they want to influence the organization. The higher up you go, the more influence that you can have in the conversation, because the more power those people have to change things.
So let's go back to this question about relevance of cybernetics then, because I mean, there must be loads of change practitioners who would say, well, that's obvious that you do that work with an organization, but are they instinctively practitioners of cybernetics, or does cybernetics give them something they wouldn't otherwise have?
I think the problem with practitioners of change and the whole notion of change practice is what the thinking is informed by. So what's the theoretical framework that underpins the approach to change? And quite commonly they fall into categories of method. So they might be about process improvement, they might be about behavioral change, they might be about team building, but each is then set in its own context within the organization. This is not universally applicable, of course.
So in that consultant jargon, they've got a hammer, so they'll find a nail. Absolutely,
yeah. So that's a risk, and so one of the things that I moved away from when I came to cybernetics in the late 1980s was that realization that I was being taught about some really good tools, but they were totally inappropriate for the nature of the problems that I was trying to address them to. So the idea of approaching an organization as a whole system and understanding that changing the way it works is partly about process, it's partly about behavior, it's partly about skills, it's partly about information, and it's all about how you synthesize those things into a coherent whole. And the risk with conventional change practitioners, the risk with non-cyberneticians, is they're looking at a partial view of it, and then indeed in conversations I've had with such practitioners who are focused on making their bit work and have no, or see themselves as having no responsibility for the bits that don't go with it. So as long as I've delivered my training program and everybody's signed off to say that they've been, my work is done, whether or not it's changed the organization, whereas the cybernetic practitioner has got to be looking at the performance of the whole system and keeping, balance is the wrong word, but keeping the integration that says, if I change the process, I'm also changing the skills that go with the process. And I might be elevating those skills. I might be requiring of somebody a more thoughtful approach, or a different approach, or a different use of the tool. So I've got to change the process. I've also got to change the skills that go with the process, and critically, the mindset that goes with both, because the mindset for, if a cybernetic system is an adaptive system, then the practitioners within it, the people that are doing the work, as well as the observers like myself, have to be adapting their behavior as much as they're adapting their process or their skills, and be thinking about the organization in terms of adaptation and change. So I learn to do a new thing a new way, and I then have to embed that new way in my way of thinking about the work. But also at a higher personal level, I'm learning to learn. So there's a learning loop going on about doing the job better, but there's also a learning loop for me as an individual about how do I learn to learn? How do I say, oh, if I've got permission to change this part and that part frustrates me, can I take that notion of being able to learn and adapt and apply it to other parts?
And that's presumably the human or the machine that's learning and adapting there.
Both, quite commonly. So there are, you know, the applications of you know, artificial intelligence in some machines these days that certainly create the illusion of quite good learning. So things like IBM's Watson as an example. As a diagnostic tool for doctors is brilliant. It will never do anything original, but its ability to find and retrieve the most relevant information for a problem is stupendous. But equally, it will never do nuance in the way that an individual human being will do nuance and kind of reflect on what they're hearing, what they're seeing, think about it, and come up with an inspired question on the back of it.
So, John, if this cybernetic stuff's so powerful and helpful, how come we don't all know about it? And how come it's not part of everyone's day-to-day thinking about the challenges of the world and the systems that run in it?
Oh, where do we start? Most of us are brought up and educated in an education system which is essentially discipline-based. We learn about English, you know, reading, writing, and arithmetic at primary school. We subsequently go into a series of subjects at you know, later years. We study history, we study geography, we study physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, etc. We then go and get professional qualifications, and all of those things tend towards a single discipline focus. So we understand the world from within the focus of being a mathematician or a biologist or indeed an accountant. We develop a language, a way of understanding the world, all of which is consistent with the view of the profession and discipline. So that's number one. When cybernetics in modern times began to be talked about and exploited more thoroughly, it was in the days of the emerging ideas of information theory and communication theory, and that was in the late 1940s. And as it happens, I've just been reading a book about all this and reminding myself of some of the history. And like all disciplines, cybernetics is populated with human beings. And human beings like to make distinctions that make them different to their neighbours. So there's a whole raft of arguments in the late 1940s and early 1950s about the difference between information theory and communication theory. And I won't decry the mathematics. I don't proclaim to understand the mathematics of some of it. But people's egos and career pursuits and funding pursuits inform the way that not just their theories have developed, but the way in which the research processes have developed. And in order to make distinctions between researcher A and researcher B, we have to find points of difference. So a science that should be inherently systemic in its approach then starts to fragment into different branches of the same thing. So there's one element of it. When you really apply the thinking about information, particularly in human organizations, in businesses and universities and religious orders, etc. For me, and this is my interpretation, the systems themselves become sustainable, they become capable of survival when we maximize the autonomy of the individual within them, whilst maintaining the coherence of a shared identity of the organization as a whole. So I want you to be as free as possible to be you, but within some minimal set of rules that we co-create probably, that define us as an organization and not as anything else. And that sounds quite obvious, really, except when you then apply it in a world, and particularly the Western world, well, actually that's probably not true, in a world in which power tends to centralize. A world in which chief executives think they have to know, understand, and be in control of everything, where presidents and prime ministers feel pretty much the same way. We're describing a world in which, to be properly cybernetic, to be properly adaptive, we need to distribute the ability to make decisions as widely as possible. And yet our tendency in human systems is to centralize power, to cluster it together. So there's a tension between the full realization of cybernetics and the full realization, if you like, of the wishes and desires of the people that lead organizations. And when you say to those people, look, what you really need to do as a chief executive is give away power. What you really need to do is let go of stuff, is to allow your people to perform and give them greater freedom. That's often seen as risky. It's often seen as undermining, and whether that's a function of their competence or their confidence, I'm never quite sure. But there's, in the 1960s, there was a big movement to try and do a lot of this stuff, and indeed cybernetics was then talked about at national level. And one of the apocryphal stories is of a very senior government minister talking to a cybernetician and basically poo-pooing it, not on the basis that the science is wrong, but that it detracted from the power of politicians to govern the country. A lot of that then distribution of power can become associated, and did become associated in the 1960s, with forms of communism and socialism as a political interpretation of what was going on, where people were seeing those, distributing power is seen as undermining government. Now, today, we would definitely argue that we are a massively centralized country, that many countries are massively centralized in terms of the way power is placed and exercised, and there are movements going on all over the world about redistributing that. In our case, we're talking about regional governments, we're talking about devolution, etc. Spain has the Basque separatists and so on. There are sort of movements of people. So the big political thing that says if we adopt these ideas, we have to give up power, and getting people to give up power is always challenging.
So that's very interesting answer. So, I mean, I heard three big chunks there, about why it's not familiar to all of us. One is the education system, focusing on particular discipline. The second is a kind of fragmented history in the way the cyberneticians maybe ended up creating more division than unity amongst themselves in the 40s and 50s. And the third one is about the kind of challenge to power and almost the philosophy that's in cybernetics that kind of goes, well, actually, you get advantage through having a clear identity, purpose to your system, and individual freedoms to be able to operate within those parameters. So that's a very interesting kind of analysis of why, excuse me, why we don't have, more routine cybernetic language. So,
can we just add a fourth one to that while we're on it? This is probably mainly a topic for a subsequent conversation. But cyberneticians themselves don't do themselves any favors. So when I started doing this work in the 1990s, the language of cybernetics is arcane, it's confusing, it's obtuse, and some would argue that the behavior of cyberneticians is very like that. So one of the things I spent a lot of time doing in my early years of working with the ideas was finding language that allowed me to communicate the ideas to people who were not themselves cyberneticians, i.e. to get out of the cybernetics box and try and describe the concepts and the ideas in the language of people not exposed previously to the science. And as president of the Cybernetics Society today, I can tell you that when I sit in a Cybernetics Society meeting, I hear much of the same arcane language, I hear much of the same obtuseness, and that's not because people are being deliberately awkward about it. It's because it's inherent in the nature of I guess, some of the people, that they're fascinated by the exploration, but don't feel the need or have the desire maybe to come out and engage. So people like me are rare in the sense of being able to have the arcane, obscure language in a room full of cyberneticians, but also then try and come out and write and talk about the ideas in language which is more acceptable. So there's that going on as well. And I suppose it is fair to say today that the work that I and others are doing is having an impact at national level again. It is working with the Treasury, it is working with national rail organisations, etc. So we're kind of breaking out, but it's a very small coterie of people.
It's an amusing thought that you could become the human face, isn't it? The acceptable human face of cybernetics.
Oh,
maybe that's for a much longer conversation over some beer.
Well, again, part of what goes with that, and we all have histories, don't we? Is that some of the early thinkers, particularly in the post-war era, certainly some of their political views, people would find challenging today. I mean, bearing in mind the context in which they were working and the experiences that they'd had that informed their personal lives. So there's something in some of that as well, which we need to think about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that fourth one, I mean, I think there's another, it's got a dimension of control and power about it. So there's something about if you have arcane language and difficult language to access and complex theories and stuff, then it makes it very hard for it to become part of people's day-to-day conversation in the pub, doesn't it? And
absolutely, we all. I wrote a paper in 1993 on that very subject, and it was all about how we use language, we use knowledge, we use information to support our own position and challenge that of others. And we see that that continues. Some of that, I think, is about, some of it's bound to be about self-preservation, if you like, about preserving the unity of a group. I think a big chunk of it is about lacking the confidence, the self-confidence, the self-assurance to expose the ideas and manage the argument. And I think so for me, part of the purpose of this is to let somebody like you sort of come along and say, hey, just explain that doesn't work for me. Give me more. And at some point, I have no doubt you will come up with a question I can't answer. But I think I see that as a good outcome of the conversation rather than a bad one, because we do want to open these ideas up to other people and let them see the utility.
So explain to me how it could be different then. So because you've just said that you get some access to national projects here in the UK, you and other people that are working in this world, but just take us forward 10, 20, 50 years. If there was a shift in understanding of cybernetics, how might that change the world that we're living in?
I'll give you a current example. There's one organisation which I have worked with for some time, which is designed around the principles of cybernetics, where the principles and practice have been discussed and worked on at length with the management team in particular, including the board. And it's an organisation which is in the public sector, and it deals with procurement, and its net return on its activity financially is about 50%. So roughly half of the money that comes in is cast off as a surplus, and that surplus goes into generating social value for other people, which is correct. So it's an organisation which is massively more profitable per pound of revenue than its competitors. So financial well-being is one dimension that we would observe. It has information systems which are designed to capture data in real time, generate reporting in real time, so that there is no bureaucracy sitting in the middle of it all, handling the data, generating reports in unstructured formats. All of the reporting is as near real time as it's possible to get. So at any given point, you can say to the organisation, where are you now? And they can push the go button and generate a set of results and say, it's the 19th of January, it's 2 minutes past 12, and this is exactly where we are now. Going into the COVID pandemic last year, like every other organisation, we had to stop bringing people into the office, have them work from home. the information systems of the organization, its hardware, its software, its applications, its reporting tools had all been designed on the assumption that people would work away from the office a lot of the time. So at lunchtime on a Friday, we decided that we should all work, we should shut the office and people should work from home for the time being. So everybody was told that afternoon. On the Monday morning, we carried on as normal, except everybody was in their dining room or their home office or wherever. Everything about the organization continued to function exactly as it had done before, because the information systems and the processes and the behaviors had been built in such a way that presence in the office didn't matter. In a generation's time, all the people that worked in that organization that work in it now will take those lessons forward. So there is an example of what an organization could look like today, let alone in 50 years' time, if it was adopting these lessons. We need to get the cybernetics written in such a way that it can be comprehended more easily, disseminated more widely. Taught in business schools would be an obvious place to start, but actually having cyberneticians demonstrate the value of the cybernetics to society at large is the most powerful thing that we can do in order to make that transformation happen, in order to allow people, encourage people to be curious about it, to ask questions about it, to challenge it, and to develop it.
So, I mean, that's a better business model and, financial improvement for an organization. But I guess I'm more interested in whether it, rather than solving business problems, can it help us with the climate challenge? Can it help ensure that, if we are going to live through a series of pandemics over the next 100 years, that, so I'm thinking about broader societal things and environmental things here, rather than necessarily just business things.
And the answer is yes. So I've had the privilege of working with these ideas in and around government now for over 10 years, particularly in the fields of infrastructure and a little bit around climate change. I'm currently working on weather resilience with one client. All of the challenges that we face today on that national social scale are describable using the language of cybernetics as a starting point. So we can talk about the cybernetics of climate change, and we can talk about the cybernetics of the adaptation that we might do to deal with it. And in fact have done so, and there's a report called Tracker, which is about climate change, about adaptation of the railway, where cybernetics ideas have been explicitly applied to understanding the information and how information can be used to enable adaptation of the railway over a 30-year view. So essentially assets wear out over about 30 years. So if you, on a railway, so if you embed adaptive behaviors and adaptive structures into the railway as you maintain it today, with a view to the environmental conditions that are likely to apply over the next 30 years, you can adapt the infrastructure to changes in climate as the climate changes with effectively marginal additional cost. But that means embracing a view of what railway you want in 30 years time, which is a big challenge. So that's about infecting the thinking, and I do mean the word infecting, the thinking of the people that are making the big decisions, the bold decisions, the propositions about how we run our country in the future. We can diagnose what's going wrong, but we need to educate people in the potentials that the tools have. One of the most frightening things in a world which is supposedly massively information enabled is that parts of it are massively data enabled, but parts of it are not. And there is an awful lot that is done, as we've seen over the course of the pandemic, that is done on very flimsy data sources, because we don't systematically capture data and use it in sensible, appropriate ways to drive and enable adaptation and learning. We guess. We have decisions which are made small p, big P, political purposes rather than rational purposes. And I get that that's necessary, but we need to understand when we're doing which, when we're making decisions which are rationally informed and which are socially or politically informed, and get those ideas being exposed, being explored at a significantly higher level in civil and military administration. Although it's fair to say the military adopt this stuff more readily, particularly the information-based thinking and approaches. Some of it's quite widespread in parts of policing as well. Very little of it is called information science, very little of it is called cybernetics, but a lot of it is going on. Where we would get the acceleration is by making it more explicitly cybernetic, by acknowledging explicitly the cybernetic nature, particularly of things like learning and adaptation, and being more deliberate about enforcing them. When a minister stands up in the Houses of Parliament or on television and talks about lessons learned, and lessons must be learned and this must never happen again, yes, I agree with them. But the bureaucratic mechanisms by which we manage our organizations, which are very often focused more on defensible accountability for spending rather than achievement of outcome, get in the way of making better decisions. So we spend all of our time, and I have examples here which I could wave at you, where the bureaucracy of the system actually gets in the way of the decision making. And it doesn't just apply in government, it does apply in the private sector, not quite as much because the profit imperative is there. But there's an awful lot of activity in organizations which is designed to defend a position rather than enable a new position. And a lot of that is wasteful. If we took the ideas of good cybernetics, Toyota lean production methodology, the Toyota method, demand-led production pull or consumption pull operation of a factory is cybernetic. It runs in a way that says, we only do something when there's demand for it. We run operating processes that stop themselves if it's going wrong. So we never make a bad one because we stop the process before it happens. We embed the adaptation in the process so that, having recognized we were going wrong, we correct it and we prevent then future error. Massively eliminates inefficiency and waste from the system, because Ono says that there are two outcomes from any process, and one is work and the other is waste. So how do we eliminate the waste becomes a really interesting question. So when you're then looking at environmental impacts and can cybernetics help with the environmental challenges, if we think of all of the activity that goes on that does not lead to a productive outcome, and we define it all as waste. So the waste heat coming from a power station or whatever. So how do we actually minimize those things? We then maximize, by contrast, the efficiency of the other parts of the system. So they're big ideas and they need big exploration.
So cybernetics has a lot to offer then. That's what I'm hearing about, the future world. And the blockers would have to be tackled. So something about the cyberneticians themselves being, clearer about what they can contribute and more joined up, but also something about the wider education of the general public and this, and also something about political will and not seeing the thinking as a threat. I am sure, these are kind of things we will come back to, but that's probably about enough for today, isn't it? Because, I think we've started to see, some of the history and some of the basic ideas and what cybernetics might be able to bring. And you've named a few concepts that we'll have to come back at and look at in much more depth. But I suspect that's probably us for today, unless you've got a few final thoughts.
No, I think I'm talked out for now. We should say thank you very much, and we'll have a second one in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks, Chris.